Hey everybody, it's James Lindsay and you are listening to the new Discourses Podcast, and we are continuing this sprawling, exciting, apparently very impactful and helpful series I'm doing called The Nazi Experiment. This is volume 9, which is really the 10th episode in the series that I've recorded, and what we're doing is going through various writings, mostly Mein Kampf, from the Nazis, but also some stuff from Carl Schmitt so far, to explain something I'm calling the Nazi experiment, which I'm obviously using as a phrasing that's in parallel to the American experiment. Of course, the American experiment has been the most successful and prosperous experiment in human governance in history. What is it based on? It's based on individual responsibility and self-government. The radical idea in the world that human beings can govern themselves and don't need a government to tell them how to be, how to produce, how to exchange, etc. But in particular, how to believe and orient their beliefs, or how to submit to beliefs of others. And so that's the American experiment. What have the results been? Tremendous prosperity, poverty reduced all around the world, the adoption of freedom in so many places, raised standards of living like you wouldn't believe, just a total transformation of the world in the beneficial direction. And it is what the founders, what we called originally as Americans, the blessings of liberty that we get by being in covenant with liberty itself. So we hold up our end, which is to be personally responsible and to govern ourselves, which requires character development, which requires virtue, which requires some ambition and the desire to do something productive to solve problems in the world for self and others. And as a result, we end up with this wonderful, prosperous society. We gain the blessings of liberty, which have been proved out since we, the people, instantiated them as our form of government about 250 years ago. Okay, by contrast, we have the Nazi experiment. What was going on? Why is the Nazi experiment? Well, in the 1920s, following World War I in particular, Germany found itself in a state. That state was called the Weimar Republic, but it was also the post-war humiliation after World War I. It was post-war penury. Things were not great for Germany, and along comes a desire to make Germany great again, as you might say, and that how that was to be done. Of course, we are trying to make America great again with the Trump experiment, with the MAGA experiment, and this has been in many ways successful. Well, the Nazis decided to try to make Germany great again with the Nazi experiment, which was going to be a racialist worldview organized under a strict leader principle where individuality is subsumed into national heroism, and everything is going to be based off of the idea that the state exists to preserve and advance the race, such that the races are all in competition with one another, blah, blah, blah. Fascist economy, fascist government structure, totalitarian program. And what happened was a catastrophe. So a country can find itself in bad situations, in degeneracy, in economic dire straits, in humiliation and whatever else, under attack by Marxists being a very key element of the circumstances that were happening in Germany in the 1910s and 20s. And then it can perform an experiment, a very radical experiment like the Nazis did, to try to solve those problems. And that solution can be a non-solution. It can be a complete failure. That's the idea of the Nazi experiment. Now, in this series so far, one of the main things, just before I say this, well, I don't want to split my sentences. In this experiment so far, in this series so far, we haven't talked much about the Holocaust. There's this huge debate going on, stupidly, idiotically, cruelly, that maybe the Holocaust didn't really happen, or it was much smaller than expressed. This view is actually taking root in the ignorant among mostly our young people who have not been adequately educated in woke schools, etc. They're learning it from propagandists, and it's kind of an alarming catastrophe. But among the lies that are being told about the Holocaust isn't just that it didn't happen and so on, or that it was much less than expressed, but that the motivations were never there. The Germans never intended to do this, and to the degree that it even happened, that it was just a kind of a contingency of war. That was Daryl Cooper's position, talking to Tucker Carlson on a major podcast episode, the Tucker Carlson Show, and Tucker Carlson calls Daryl Cooper America's most honest historian for relaying this revisionist lie about the Holocaust, that it wasn't the Nazis' intention. So one of the points of this Nazi experiment series is not just to lay out what were the contents of this absolute catastrophic failure called the Nazi experiment, which came to a crashing halt in 1945. The question also, or the purpose also, is to reveal that these lies that we're being told about the Nazi period in history are just that. They are lies. So we haven't talked a lot about the Holocaust. I recently went to Israel and visited their Holocaust memorial, Yad Vashem, which means a memorial and a name in Hebrew. It's a stunning experience to see. The point of the place is educational, but it's very impactful, obviously, to walk through a Holocaust museum. Yad Vashem claims that they now can verify over 5 million names of people who died in the Holocaust, but that would leave, if we're just documenting Jews, 1 million who still haven't even been identified, just lost to the ravages of the Nazi experiment. And of course, there's this denialism, and that's hard to bear when you actually see, the various evidences. You hear the stories. Of course, some of us, if we're old enough, grew up reading stories of the Holocaust and what actually happened there. Elie Wiesel in his book Night, Viktor Frankl in his book Man's Search for Meaning. I forgot the woman's name is that wrote The Tin Ring, but The Tin Ring, which I've read also, harrowing stuff, like just rough. So it's shocking and painful to watch people try to deny or downplay this, but it also speaks to the lie. So the claim in the lie about the Holocaust is that it's not, in fact, something that the Nazis intended, that they got caught in their war machine circumstances. And in fact, what Daryl Cooper said, it was that it was a humanitarian option to start liquidating Jews instead of leaving them to die in these camps by starvation. So why were they in the camps in the first place? Well, they were in the camps in the first place because the Germans were taking territory, specifically, importantly, through Poland, where there were tons of Jewish people, like 10 or 11% of the population at the time was Jewish, and they didn't know what to do with them, so they just stuck them in these camps until the war was over, and then they were going to figure it out, right? Camps like Auschwitz and eventually like Treblinka and stuff like this. Like none of this is a good scene. So here I have this book that I'm going to read from today. This is not Mein Kampf. I'm going to read 3 pieces. They're all short that are kind of together from this book called The Third Reich Source Book, which is 957 pages of exciting history from the Nazis. This is stuff written by the Nazis. So what I'm actually going to read to you in this episode is something from way down in the middle, starting on page 722, as a matter of fact, of this 900-something page book. In the section of the book, or the unit of the book, part 10, there's a lot in this book, War, Conquest, and the Annihilation of the Jews. So we're talking about 1939 forward. So this section of what this book is a bunch of pieces of writing or speeches or things from the Nazis to explain in their own words what was going on, organized into time periods. So this time period 10, is 1939 through 1942. The Holocaust begins. And the 3 pieces are going to be Hitler's speech that he gave, let me see where, speech to the Great German Reichstag in 1939, delivered 30 January 1939, as a matter of fact. It's not very long. The introduction to this section of the book, which I'm going to read first, then Hitler's speech to the Reichstag in 1939, and then I'm going to go backwards to the very second thing that's in the book, and I'm going to read a letter that Hitler wrote in 1919, 20 years earlier. So we're going to go back in time 20 years and see how it relates to what was happening 20 years later when the Holocaust begins in 1939. So let's just kind of dive in. We'll read from the description of this section first. This is put together by the editors of the book, the Third Reich source book. Then we'll read Hitler's speech. Of course, part of the lie that we're being confronted with is that Hitler's speeches were just about how much he loved his people. He loved the Germans. He loved Germany. We'll hear his great speech in 1939 to the Reichstag, and then we'll go backwards and read this letter. So it starts off describing the situation, the 1939 to 1942 early Holocaust period. It says, Nazi ideology conceived of the opposition between Aryans and Jews as a world historical battle for racial supremacy. So out of the gate, it explains that, make no mistake, the Nazis, the Holocaust wasn't some error of the war. They saw the opposition between Aryans and Jews as a world historical battle for racial supremacy. We already heard that, by the way, very clearly, repeatedly in the other episodes of this series that I've read in Mein Kampf, which Hitler wrote while he was in prison in the mid-1920s. They go on and explain it exactly in the terms that Mein Kampf gives, so we have every reason to believe this is accurate. A racially pure Germany demanded, as Hitler's chief ideologist Alfred Rosenberg wrote in his 1930 Myth of the 20th Century, the radical removal, indeed elimination of the Jews. So let's take out all the parentheses here and just read the sentence for its point. A racially pure Germany demanded the radical removal, indeed elimination of the Jews. Only through such an apocalyptic event could Germany again become a, quote, healthy nation. That would be in the view of Alfred Rosenberg. If you recall from one of the earlier episodes, Alfred Rosenberg is also the chief ideologist who outlined the concept of positive Christianity, the ersatz religion, the fake Christianity that the Nazis were using as a bridge to get Germans off of their Christian beliefs and into Nazi beliefs fully without the Christian part. Same guy. Upon reading Rosenberg in 1942, the Jewish philologist Victor Klemperer, living with his non-Jewish wife, saw the tract as an almost comic commentary on the time. Quote, only Nordic man has true religion, true artistic genius, true science, is truly able to observe nature, inner freedom of the soul. Jews without religion, materialistic, Jehovah's arbitrary power, magic. End quote. The ravings of Rosenberg became the policies of the Reich. So that was a direct quote from reading Alfred Rosenberg's, I'm assuming, Myth of the 20th Century. Only Nordic man has true religion, true artistic genius, true science, is able to truly observe nature, inner freedom of the soul. And he compares Jews without religion being materialistic and Jehovah's arbitrary power as magic. Okay, so these were the kinds of policies that were getting written into the Reich, and what this is a kind of anti-Semitism that's designed to characterize the Nordic Aryan as spiritually superior to the not spiritual at all, Jews without religion, Jews. So Aryan versus Jew becomes critical, and the only way to make Germany healthy, the Nazi experiment saw the problem with Germany as a problem of racial contamination. That's why they failed, and that's why they lost. That's the Nazi diagnosis for Germany's problems after they fought and lost World War I. So the apocalyptic event of the Holocaust, of the removal, indeed elimination of the Jews, is given as the only way to make Germany healthy again. No analogies to Maha here, which is focused instead on the CDC and stuff. It says, from the Nuremberg laws of 1935 to the confiscation of Jewish property in August 1938, Jews were systematically deprived of all rights, from new laws that forced all Jews to take the same middle names, Sarah and Israel, to the banning of pet ownership. The threat level rose precipitously after the Reichskristallnacht. So Kristallnacht is what we usually just call it, but the Reichskristallnacht in November 1938, when synagogues and Jewish shops were destroyed and as many as 400 Jews were murdered. For those like 9 of you out there who don't know what Kristallnacht refers to, the crystal means glass, so it's the night of broken glass, because the Nazis went around in 1938 and smashed, or was it 39, 38, went around and smashed windows, smashed windows and broke things. And so broken glass was everywhere throughout the night, November 1938. So that's when the Kristallnacht occurred. That's what it was. It was the night of broken glass because Jewish synagogues and shops were destroyed. And it says as many as 400 Jews were murdered in the Kristallnacht. If you go back and listen to when I'm talking about Melita Moshman's book, Account Rendered, she actually talks in that book about how she encountered Kristallnacht and how it was shocking for her, but she had so much cognitive dissonance that she was able to kind of shuttle it to the side and just see it as kind of like random street violence or whatever that doesn't really indicate anything systematic. Carrying on here, it says, in a speech to the Reichstag on 30th January 1939, which we're going to read in a minute, Hitler declared that, quote, the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe, end quote, would be his response if a new world war commenced. From that point, elimination of the Jews, whether by exile or forced immigration, became ever more central to the Nazi vision of a new Aryan German and then a new European order. So let's unpack what happened there. There's a lot happening. So Jews are getting suppressed. Kristallnacht has happened. They've been lots of murders, lots of destroying. They've had their property confiscated. This is in the 38, August to November. Then in January of 39, Hitler comes out and makes a speech. He's launching World War II. And he makes a speech. It's basically a hostage speech. He says, if a new world war commences, notice he's taking territory. And he says, if a new world war commences, the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe would be his response. He says that they're going to, look, I'm going to go take over the world, or Europe, and if you try to stop me, I'm going to kill all the Jews. So he's actually arranging intentionally the Jews as a race of people with millions of people involved as a hostage situation against his military ambitions in Europe. So notice how totally screwed up that is. So this is kind of the space where people like Daryl Cooper or his, what's the name of his guy that he read? I already forgot. The discredited historian that he got his ideas from. But anyway, this is where you get this propaganda coming in and saying, oh, well, Hitler was forced to kill all the Jews because of Churchill. No, Hitler issued a threat, which was, I'm going to go take over Europe, and if you try to stop me, I'm going to murder all the Jews. So then when Churchill tries to stop him, you don't get to blame Churchill. It's the exact same story as what's just happened in Gaza after October 7th. They've gone and taken all these hostages, and then they hide behind human shields. And if you try to do anything about it, it's somehow your fault. No, this is a hostage situation. So it needs to be made very clear that before he launches the full assault of World War II, Hitler has arranged a declaration that he will murder all the Jews if he's not allowed to get away with it. He's organized a genocidal hostage situation against Europe. And now you have people like Daryl Cooper on Tucker Carlson trying to take that situation and to say that it was Churchill's fault. He should have just let Hitler go east and take over and take France. That's not east of Germany, that's west. But, just let him do it. And if you don't, he's going to kill all the Jews. So obviously you can't do that. You have to let him do it, or else it's your fault. If Churchill hadn't fought back, this wouldn't have happened. And then you can displace the blame. So this is all orchestrated knowingly and intentionally by Hitler in this Reichstag speech in 1939, the beginning of 1939, just before he launches the war. We continue reading. It says, with the occupation of France in May 1940, the Nazi press unleashed a full-scale campaign against the Jewification of Europe and framed the war as a worldwide struggle against Jewish, which was used as a synonym for British and American, Jewish finance capital, as Rosenberg stated in 1941. So the ideologists of the Reich claimed that what was really going on was a worldwide struggle against Jewish finance capital, which was tied up in British and American interests, thus justifying their claim for the war. And the point was the Nazi press unleashed a full-scale campaign against the Jewification of Europe. The Jews and the Americans and the British are turning Europe Jewish, kind of like the propaganda we hear today that the Jews through IPAC and whatever else in Israel all control America and America's Congress and Trump and the presidency and so on, with controversially J.D. Vance touching his toe against that water recently by saying, it's said that Jews control the president, but not this president, meaning President Trump, which sounds good for Trump, but is not so good for the implication that it might or might not make plausible deniability. So this is what's actually happening. The Nazis are saying the Jews are Jewifying Europe, and we're going to fight a war against it, and it's against Jewish finance capital. In other words, Jewish control that's happening through British and American interests. And this comes from this same ideologist who created the positive Christianity nonsense, who created this Aryans versus Jews Nordic spiritual battle, Alfred Rosenberg, in 1941. So in 1942, it says, after 1942, Hitler returned often to the prophecy, and that's in quotes, he had made in the Reichstag speech, which he wrongly dated to the actual beginning of the war on 1st September 1939. So Hitler goes back revisionist, claims he makes a prophecy. This view, it says, was echoed by Goebbels when he declared the Jews guilty for the war in an article published in the periodical Das Reich in November 1941. So notice the Nazis are doing the woke thing. They're displacing the blame. We didn't want to kill the Jews. It was the Jews' fault by Jewifying Europe. It's all the Jews' fault. And Hitler's already set the stage for this with his prophecy that if anybody tries to stop him with a world war, then he's going to kill all the Jews. So let's not get confused about what's really going on. On September 1st, 1939, which is the official start of the war, the German Wehrmacht, which is their army, attacked across the German-Polish border with overwhelming air power to support massive movements of troops and tanks across multiple fronts. So there's the beginning of World War II officially. Go back about 8 months, Hitler's making the announcement that if anybody tries to do a world war against him, he's going to kill all the Jews. The initial intent of the Germans was to clear the Reichsgau Varthland, the western part of Poland, to be annexed to the Reich, of all Jews. The initial intent of the German was to clear the land of all Jews, unleashing a radicalization in the practices of violence as the war progressed. This in Yad Vashem was explained to us as the Holocaust of bullets, which is before the concentration camps. So just mass graves and people just killing and robbing and looting Jews all across Poland as the Nazis marched across, like a kind of weird madness that was led by the Einsatzgruppen, German security police. Okay, so where we leave off. Okay, so let's just read that piece again. The initial intent of the Germans was to clear the Reichsgau Varthland of all Jews, unleashing a radicalization in the practices of violence as the war progressed. This doesn't sound like they were going along, just kind of taking over territory, putting people in camps for their own safety, and then whoops, oh no, they're going to starve, so let's do something about it, like we hear from Daryl Cooper on Tucker Carlson. Whatever inhibitions, they write, might have forestalled full-scale racial annihilation no longer obtained. So there were no longer inhibitions to stop the clearing out, the intentional destruction of the Jews. Up till the end of 1939, there were reasons people held back, and what this is saying is whatever inhibitions might have forestalled full-scale racial annihilation up to that point no longer work. On 23 August 1939, Joachim von Ribbentrop, the German foreign minister, and Vyacheslav Molotov, this is the Molotov Compact, Vyacheslav Molotov, his Soviet counterpart, had agreed to a non-aggression pact and divided Poland. So this is a famous Molotov Pact where the Soviets and the Germans decided they were not at war with one another. They'll just split Poland in half. The Soviet Union helped the Nazis dismember Poland, invading its eastern part on September 1939. In a matter of weeks, independent Poland, which had existed for barely 20 years, vanished. The conquest of Poland brought with it unprecedented violence. In the notorious Operation Tannenberg, more than 15,000 Polish civilians designated as intelligentsia, as well as thousands of Jews, were shot by the Einsatzgruppen, death squads of the SS security police, under Heydrich's control. These units were attached to the Wehrmacht, that's the army. In his candid lecture notes, General Johannes Błaszkowicz, 1833 to 1948, commander-in-chief of the Polish invasion army, expressed his antipathy to the slaughter and predicted that it would make the Polish population more rather than less sympathetic to the Jews. So here you have a German general who's watching this slaughter of Jews in Poland and saying this is going to turn the Poles against us. This is not a good idea. He presciently warned of the rampant brutalization and moral decrepitude that will rapidly spread like a plague throughout the fabric of the German folk. That's a direct quote. He presciently warned of the quote. So what is this war against the Jews in Poland going to actually accomplish? First of all, he says it's going to turn the Poles against us and toward the Jews. And secondly, he warned of, quote, the rampant brutalization and moral decrepitude that will rapidly spread like a plague throughout the fabric of the German folk. So he's warning that if we continue on this dehumanizing, genocidal path against the Jews, as the German army and war machine intends to, what is going to happen is that we're going to lose the support of the Poles, we're going to lose the support of others, and we're going to degrade ourselves as a people. His protests enraged Hitler, who relieved him of his command on 29 May 1940. The lesson was clear. By the time Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941, the Wehrmacht had become a Nazi-fied organization that its leaders, like Field Marshal von Reichenau, expressly saw as the instrument of the war of annihilation. So this guy's like, we shouldn't be doing a wholesale destruction. Our military agenda doesn't require an annihilation of the Jews. It's going to turn Poland against us. It's going to degrade who we are. Hitler gets pissed off, relieves him of his command, betrays Russia with Operation Barbarossa, and by that point, just a year or so later, a year and a half later, the army had become so Nazified that its leaders expressly saw the existence of the Nazi army, the German army, as being the instrument of the war of annihilation. It wasn't the war of conquest. It's a war of annihilation. Of what? Of Jews. Quote, the soldier in the Eastern Territories is not merely a fighter according to the rules of the art of war, but also a bearer of ruthless national ideology and the avenger of bestialities that have been inflicted upon German and racially related nations, end quote. So that's how he saw this field marshal. That's how this field marshal by that point saw the point of the German army and the soldier in it. He's not a fighter doing war. He is the bearer of a ruthless national ideology, that's the German racialist worldview, and the avenger of the bestialities, that's the mythology of how the Germans had been put into a bad position. Notice the parallels, by the way, to today, what our young men tend to believe. They've been, bullied and like they've heard toxic masculinity and stuff by all this feminism. Of course, they all live, for the most part, comfortable middle-class lives. A lot of them have gone off to college. They're doing reasonably well. They're just frustrated, and there are huge problems like how expensive housing is, how weird dating is in the digital age, and so on. But they see this as bestialities that have been inflicted upon them. This is a dangerous situation. So the Nazis had convinced the Germans that Jews and other racial contaminants had inflicted bestialities on them that had humiliated and ruined Germany. And our young men are being convinced, and we repeat this. Those of us who are against the woke right repeat it. Yeah, it's true that we've really done young men wrong. This is dangerous. We've got to think carefully about this. This is dangerous. You have a lot of middle-class guys who think that they've lived through brutality because of the idiocy of feminism, calling them names, raising them to think that they're Nazis, putting them through the bullshit of COVID, which, by the way, we all went through. We all went through that, not just you guys, all of us. I know that you have less life to compare it against if you're a young person, but we all went through that crap. You're not unique here. But because the Germans were able to propagandize their people into believing that what had happened to them after World War I was bestialities of the circumstance to the native German, the racial German and racially related nations, they carried forth as a brutal, it's what it says, brutal avengers of this and a bearer of a ruthless national ideology. This is why we're talking about the Nazi experiment now. The similar conditions producing similar problems with people being maybe willing to make similar mistakes. And this went bad. This general that got relieved of his duty was a whistleblower who was like, it wasn't even really a whistleblower. He was just like, this isn't going to work. And Hitler flipped out, relieved him of his duty, and the army concentrates on this ruthless brutality, this dehumanization of themselves, which is exactly what the general predicted. It goes on. Occupied Poland, with its 1.7 million Jews, the largest Jewish population in the world, quickly became a land of ghettos and camps. On 21st September, Heydrich instructed the Einsatzgruppen commanders to concentrate the Jews from the countryside in ghettos in the larger towns and cities in preparation for mass deportation to a Jewish reservation, Judenreservat. Just 1 month later, on 26 October 1939, decrees were issued mandating forced labor for Jews resident in the general government, the Rump part of Poland occupied by the German military under the brutal anti-Semite Hans Frank. Heydrich made no bones about distinguishing these short-term measures from the, quote, final aim, which was to remain secret. That final aim is the final solution, which was to kill all the Jews. By the way, ahead of time, known. Polish-speaking middle-class Jews were rounded up and placed in the ghetto at Warsaw or in the city of Lodz, now renamed Linzmannstadt. Lodz. Julius Streicher's rabid Der Stürmer charged the Jews with conducting a war, quote, against non-Jewish peoples. This is all sounding familiar to our time today. The image of the, quote, Jewish enemy dominated wartime propaganda. Sounds like social media today. Even seeing the use of, quote, black soldiers, mainly from North Africa, in the French army during World War I as part of a Jewish conspiracy. Sounds like social media today. In addition to the Jews, all non-German ethnic groups were to be, quote, racially cleansed, deprived of education, and recruited as forced laborers. Sinti and Roma, so-called gypsies, were segregated and sent to concentration camps. Jews not fortunate enough to flee to Soviet-occupied Poland were deported as late as February 1940 to the general government. That's the zone in Poland that was in between. Nazi ideologues conjured up solutions to what was euphemistically called, quote, the final solution to the Jewish question. Wonder what that was. For example, a plan suggested in June 1940, then openly discussed by such regime zealots as Karl Bumbach, proposed that Jews could be eliminated through Europe through exile to the French colony of Madagascar, but this scheme was ultimately judged impracticable. With the invasion of Poland, as Himmler observed in 1940, it was vital to set the ethnic groups found in the East against one another, and especially against the Jews. The racist ideology was extended to eliminate the Asiatic Jewish danger, as Field Marshal von Reichenau ordered the invasion of the Soviet Union on 22 June 1941. Goering had already set up the groundwork for mass annihilation in a letter to Heydrich on 31 July 1941. On 12 December 1941, the day after Germany declared war on the United States, Goebbels recorded in his diary that Hitler said, quote, the world war is here, and the destruction of the Jews must be a necessary consequence. The necessary consequence, actually. Even earlier, gas vans had been used at the Klemno extermination site, and the construction of gas chambers had begun at the extermination camp at Belzec. All this culminated in Heydrich's convening of a high-level conference to discuss the scope and administration of a systemic, quote, evacuation to the east, understood as the murder of all European Jews among a select group of high-ranking officials at the Wannsee Conference in Berlin. So there's a short historical account of the time. Pardon my inability to read and pronounce certain things. So the section here is the Holocaust begins. Chapter 350 in this book is Adolf Hitler, Speech to the Great German Reichstag, delivered 30 January 1939. So this is the actual speech that Hitler later regarded as prophetic. This is the speech given in January when the war started in September later that same year. He says, "The German folk has no desire to have its affairs settled or governed by an alien people. France to the French, England to the English, America to the Americans, and Germany to the Germans." Now, we have to pause because that's literally exactly the kind of crap we're hearing today. He says, "We are determined to put an end to the way this alien people is infiltrating our society, taking control of every leading institution in the country, and to eliminate this alien folk once and for all. For we are intent on educating our own people to assume these positions." So the idea is the alien people are the Jews, and they're going to have to be eliminated because they're taking positions away from Germans, and they are actually governing according to their rules, and they're going to get rid of them. This is what Hitler's launching off on his mostly peaceful speech to the German people, to the Reichstag. "We have hundreds of thousands," he says, "of the most intelligent sons of peasants and workers. We will educate and train them as we have already begun to do, and we hope that they will someday occupy the leading positions of state and society, together with members of our own educated elite, not with these racial aliens." Again, these are the same kinds of messages that we're hearing today. This is one of those moments where my jaw was on the floor reading through this the first time, thinking, my God, this is the propaganda of today, but this is straight from Hitler's pre-war 1939 speech to the Reichstag. Above all, Hitler says, though, German culture, as its name implies, is a Germanic culture, not a Jewish one, and accordingly its care and administration will be placed in the hands of our own people. And when the rest of the world works itself into a frenzy of hypocritical hue and cry over this barbaric expulsion of such indispensable, culturally superior elements from Germany, then we can only shake our heads in amazement at the conclusions they draw from these actions. For how thankful must people be to us for liberating these august bearers of culture and making them available to the rest of the world? Okay, what's he talking about? So Hitler's being sarcastic here, you have to understand. So he says they're going to get rid of all the Jews, right? And so then he says, and when the rest of the world works itself into a frenzy of hypocritical hue, so there's where the sarcasm gets noted. Everybody's a hypocrite because he says, they're all going to say, the Germans are doing this horrible thing. But he's going to point out that nobody will harbor the Jews. Nobody wants them because he's going to suggest that everybody knows that they're no good. This is the propaganda we hear today of why did they get kicked out of every country that they've ever been in. So, and when the rest of the world works itself into a frenzy of hypocritical hue and cry over this barbaric expulsion, there's the sarcasm, barbaric expulsion of such indispensable culturally superior elements from Germany. He's being sarcastic about Jews. He thinks that the expulsion's not barbaric, but people will say it is, and that the Jews are allegedly indispensable culturally superior elements. That's sarcasm. He thinks that they're the opposite. And so what he's saying is everybody's a hypocrite. They're going to say Germany is being barbaric and expelling indispensable culturally superior elements from its population. But then what he's going to get to the point is, but nobody else wants them either because it's all bullcrap. He says, then we can only shake our heads in amazement at the conclusions they draw from these actions. For how thankful, here's the sarcasm again, must people be to us for liberating these august bearers. He does not believe that about Jews. These august bearers of culture and making them available to the rest of the world. So Hitler says, we're going to throw them all out. So the rest of the world's going to be happy because they're so great, right? And then he's about to pull it. No, they're not going to be. He says, based on their own expressed views on the subject, the rest of the world would have no excuse for refusing to welcome these extremely high caliber people in their own countries. There's no plausible explanation for why the Germans of all people should be burdened with members of this race, while in those countries that so enthusiastically laud them as a splendid people, their applications for immigration are suddenly rejected on the flimsiest of pretexts. Do you catch Hitler's sarcasm here? Do you know what he's doing now? He's saying the rest of the world is like, no, Germany's barbaric. All the Jews are great. How could they? But then when they try to leave Germany and they apply for asylum in the United States or other countries, they get turned down. The other countries don't want them. Their applications, in fact, they call them splendid people, but then their applications, the Jewish applications for immigration, are suddenly rejected on the flimsiest of pretexts. And Hitler explains, because there can be no peace in Europe until the Jewish question is out of the way. That's his explanation. It is entirely possible that, sooner or later, this very problem will be the one to produce an agreement in Europe between nations that might not have easily come together otherwise. Pause to reflect on today. So he's saying the Jewish question, there can't be any peace in Europe as long as there's Jews. The Jewish question is going to have to be settled. And he goes, you know what? The Jewish question, the Jewish problem, this very problem might be the one. It is entirely possible, he says, that sooner or later, this problem, the existence of Jews, will be the one to produce an agreement in Europe between nations that might not have easily come otherwise. He's saying they don't really care about Jews. They know the truth about Jews. Maybe we're all going to be able to unite in dislike of Jews. What's going on today? You've got the left and the right in America, after being unable to get along about anything, uniting in their hatred of Israel. And they're agreeing, Christians are agreeing with Muslims in their hatred of Israel. What is going on? This is going on. He says there is enough territory in the world for everyone, but the first thing that needs to happen is that this notion that the Jews were somehow entitled by the hand of God to be beneficiaries of a certain percentage of the body and productive labor of other nations must be dismissed once and for all. The Jews are just going to have to adapt themselves to the rigor of solid, constructive activity, just as all other peoples do. Either that, or they will succumb sooner or later to a crisis of unimaginable magnitude. And on this day, one that is perhaps memorable not only for us Germans, I would like to add one more thing. In my lifetime, I have very often been a prophet and have mostly been ridiculed for it. In the period of my struggle for power, it was primarily the Jews who laughed off my prophecies that I would one day assume leadership of the German state and the entire German folk, and that the Jewish problem would be among the many I would finally solve. I believe, however, that German Jewry is now choking on its resounding laughter. Today, I will again be a prophet and say, if international finance Jewry in and outside Europe succeeds in plunging nations into another world war, then the end result will not be the Bolshevization of the planet and thus the victory of the Jews. It will be the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. So Hitler's saying, if this is the hostage part, this is where he's saying, if the Jews, with their international finance, so that's America and Britain involved in Jewish finances, he would see it, push this to world war, don't let me get away with what I'm going to do, which is going to expropriate every Jew from Europe, he's already said, then the end result will not be the Bolshevization of the planet and the victory of the Jews, which, P.S., those are not the same thing. Bolsheviks are not very keen on Jews either. It will be the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. That's what Hitler says in a few months in advance of World War II. The era of propagandistic defenselessness among non-Jewish nations and peoples is over. National Socialist Germany and Fascist Italy are in possession of the means to make clear to the world in no uncertain terms the nature of this problem that so many people recognize instinctively but cannot explain scientifically. At the moment, it may be possible for the Jew to conduct his unscrupulous campaigns in other countries under the cover of the press, film, radio advertising, theater, literature, etc., all of which are in his control. If this people again succeeds in leading masses by the millions into war that only serves these utterly senseless Jewish interests, then there will be a campaign that will be so effective as to have completely bagged the beast in just a few years in Germany alone. People are tired of dying on battlefields just so that this international race might profit from the business of war and satisfy its Old Testament thirst for revenge. The Jewish slogan, "Proletarians of the world unite," that's a communist slogan, not Jewish, by the way, will be triumphed by a higher calling. Productive nations of the world, know your common enemy. So there's your friend-enemy distinction. You have the leader declaring the enemy. It's Jews who are working through international finance. This is Hitler's speech to the Reichstag in 1939, in January of 1939, in advance of launching World War II, where he declares a hostage situation for the Jews if anybody tries to stop him, and he displaces blame. He's going to do what he's going to do, and if anybody tries to stop him, that's international Jewish finance trying to stop him, and the Jews will be annihilated as a result in revenge. But he also says that if they do this, the Jews will reveal themselves. This is all identical to the propaganda that we're hearing today. And what's the story? The Jewish slogan, the communist slogan really, of the proletarians of the world unite, will be trumped by a higher calling. Productive nations of the world know your common enemy. In other words, all the enemies of the world turn against the Jews, but the nation of the Jews is Israel, and we're hearing the same thing now. And in open defiance, as I related in my recent podcast about going to Israel, titled Am Israel Chai, guess what, Hitler? Am Israel Chai. The Jewish people live. So that was Hitler in 1939. And so let's go backwards in time. It'll take me a second to find the page because this is a humongous book. To 1919, when Hitler wrote a letter at the very beginning of his adventure in National Socialism. He wrote a letter explaining his intentions. So again, the reason I'm sharing this is that the propaganda is that Hitler was backed into the corner of having to do the Holocaust and exterminate 6 million Jews and 3 to 4 million other people outside of the war machine. And you just heard from Hitler's plans a few months before he launched World War II that is not what the case is. The case was that he's going to eliminate Jews from Europe one way or the other, period, if he's hindered in his imperialist ambitions, his war ambitions. So he had this intention. He was using the Jews. First of all, he wanted them dead, but second of all, he was using them as collateral against war. And then when that didn't work out, as he launched Operation Barbarossa, and then the United States gets into the war, he says it's now a world war. We're going to have to eliminate the Jews, by which point his ideologists had congealed on the idea of a final solution that was not to ship them to Madagascar. That was too complicated. So now we go backwards in time. Adolf Hitler, letter to Adolf Gimlich, written 16th September 1919. So that was the 370th thing or whatever in the book. This is the second thing in the book. And so this is a letter Hitler wrote in 1919, which is when he first joined the German Workers' Party, which was not even yet called the National Socialist German Workers' Party. And when he joined it, a lot of people, actually, I didn't know the history either until recently, Hitler was member number 7. This wasn't like a big party and he's lots of people and he joined. There were 6 weirdos. And Hitler thinks these guys are great. And he signs up with these 6 weirdos and becomes member number 7. And it took them a long time to get any people. So that thing that we read from Mein Kampf a few episodes back, the one where we do the 40 points or whatever of the Nazi program, when we look back at that and you hear the enthusiasm that he finally has a crowd listening to him, you have to realize that he rose up from being number 7 in the entire party to ever join it. And this is back at that point in time. So 20 years before his Reichstag speech in 1939, back in 1919, Hitler writes, "Dear Herr Gimlich, if the danger posed by Jewry for our folk today finds expression in the undeniable aversion among broad sectors of our population, the cause of this aversion is not to be sought for the most part in a clear recognition of the consciously or unconsciously systematic and pernicious effect of the Jews as a whole upon our nation. Rather, it arises largely from personal contact, from the personal impression left by the individual Jew, almost always an unfavorable one. For this reason, anti-Semitism is too easily characterized as a mere emotional phenomenon, and yet this is incorrect. Anti-Semitism as a political movement may not and cannot be defined by emotional impulses, but by recognition of the facts. These are the facts. First, Jewry is absolutely a race and not a religious association. Even a Jew never designates himself as a Jewish German or a Jewish Pole or a Jewish American, but always as a German, Polish, or American Jew. The Jew has never yet adopted much beyond the language of the foreign peoples in whose midst he lives. A German who is forced to avail himself of the French language in France, Italian in Italy, Chinese in China, does not thereby become a Frenchman, Italian, or German or Chinaman any more than the Jew who lives among us and is forced to avail himself of the German language becomes a German. Neither does the Mosaic faith, as essential as it is to the survival of this race, unequivocally settle the question of whether someone is a Jew or non-Jew. There is scarcely a race whose members belong exclusively to any one specific religion. Throughout thousands of years of inbreeding, often restricted to a very limited group, the Jew has in general preserved his race and its peculiarities far more distinctly than many of the peoples amongst whom he has lived. And this is the reason that we have a non-German alien race in our midst, which is neither willing nor able to sacrifice its racial character, nor to deny its sentiments, thoughts, and aims, and yet still possesses all the political rights we do. If the Jew's sentiments are restricted to the purely material realm, his thoughts and aims all the more so. His dance around the golden calf is becoming a ruthless struggle for all those earthly possessions that, in our heart of hearts, we know should not be the most highly prized and sought after on earth. The value of the individual is no longer determined by his character or by the significance of his achievements on behalf of the whole, but exclusively by the size of his fortune, by his money. This is also what Karl Marx said about the Jews. On the Jewish Question by Karl Marx, which he wrote in 1843, some years before this. A nation's esteem, Hitler carries on, is no longer to be measured by the sum of its moral and spiritual prowess, but rather by the wealth of its material positions. So here we have Hitler saying the exact same thing the woke right is saying, that we shouldn't be focusing on GDP, the gross domestic product. We should be looking at moral and spiritual prowess, not GDP. We should be looking at virtue and values, not GDP. They have this whole argument against GDP. Well, Hitler is saying that the Jewish influence is what's made people care about money instead of caring about moral and spiritual prowess. These sentiments, Hitler says, are the basis for those thoughts and aims centering on money and power, both of which protect and preserve those very sentiments that render the Jew unscrupulous in his choice of methods and means, and ruthless in their enjoyment to those ends, or employment to those ends. So this is the same thing the communists say about the bourgeois, except now you have Hitler saying it about the Jew. And this is in 1919. He hasn't developed the Nazi Party doesn't even exist yet. He hasn't developed Nazi ideology. The anti-Semitism precedes the Nazi ideology, and it mirrors the Marxist structure of oppressor and oppressed, or bourgeois versus proletarian. And now it's the Jew versus the German instead. And the way that the Jew is ruining Germany is by making everything be about money, which is the same argument Karl Marx made. In autocratically ruled states, Hitler says, he, meaning the Jew, wheedles his way into the favor of, quote, His Majesty, then abuses that power like a leech to bleed the nation's people. In democracies, he vies for the favor of the masses, bows down before the, quote, majesty of the people, and recognizes only the majesty of money. This again sounds exactly like the Marxists about Jews. He destroys the character of princes with Byzantine flattery, national pride, which is the strength of a folk, with ridicule, and the shameless cultivation of depravity. We face the same propaganda about Jews in America today. This is where you'll see the woke right guys constantly saying, who brought pornography in? Was it the Qataris? Did the Muslims bring pornography? No, it was Jews. He destroys the character of princes with Byzantine flattery. That's IPAC, buying our politicians. National pride, which is the strength of a folk, with ridicule and the shameless cultivation of depravity. His weapon of war is public opinion that is never expressed in the press, but which is nonetheless orchestrated and falsified by it. His power is the power of money, which multiplies in his hands effortlessly and endlessly by way of accrued interest. and which forces the folk under the most dangerous of yokes, whose ultimately tragic consequences are concealed by the initial attraction of gold and glitter. So the folk are crushed under interest, is what he's saying, usury. And you're hearing exactly this, in particular with the deal with trying to buy a home and with getting out from under student loan debt. It wasn't the universities that screwed people over, it was the Jews and their dirty concept of interest, which interest is like, I don't know, maybe young people don't understand why interest exists. I mean, I'm trying to do this dramatically and I don't really want to take a basic economics like interlude, but it's basically that money represents the ability to do things in the world. You could do things with money, and one of the things you can do with money, you don't just spend it to enjoy yourself. That's literally, I'm sorry, poor people thinking. You can invest money to build more money. You can take your money and buy something that makes your life better or that advances your interests in business. That's the idea of capitalism, is that you should use your money to advance your money. It's also the parable of the talents, by the way, in the gospel. Okay, so if you can take your money and invest it or buy a freaking machine to make something and sell the product of that machine, if you can do that, then you having your own money has value over time. You can do things with your money over time. So if you loan your money to somebody else, you can't do things with your money because you're letting them do something with your money. So they can expect to be able, they probably borrowed the money to do something productive with it. And they're going to go try to do something with it that's productive. And when they can make money, just like you could make money off of your money, they can make money off of your money. They can invest it. They can use it. They can get a loan to buy a shop and set up shop and start running a business. And so there is an expected amount of money that you can make off of your money in a given period of time. Say it's $10 off of if you have $100, you could make $10 off of that $100 over the course of a year. That's called 10% interest, by the way, 10% accrual of interest. Well, if you loan the $100 to somebody at the beginning of the year, they can be expected to make that $10 instead of you. So the deal is that the interest is that you're saying, look, I'll loan you my money. You go do something productive with it. I don't have the ideas or the energy to do it right now. So you go put my money to work and you pay me back for some of that time value that my money has. That's why interest exists. That's the whole reason it exists. You could be doing something with your own money that might increase your net opportunity or your net worth. And since you're allowing somebody else to do it in your place, there's an expected value that they might be able to make off of that. And you're saying, pay me for that. So then their game becomes to beat the expected value, pay you the expected value. And guess what? You both benefit from it. Jews didn't invent this. It's just common sense about what the money's about. But this is what the whole usury argument is about. Of course, usury means excessive interest, and it's not actually considered okay. But the idea that there's interest bearing anything in banking has been completely poorly understood. And the Jews did this, and this is alleged to be the basis of their wealth. What they're actually doing is funding capital underneath the rest of the society, but you can get caught in debt if you screw up. So there's this kind of dark side to the whole thing. But anyway, this is what Hitler's actually explaining in a very nasty, radicalizing way. His power, the Jews' power, is the power of money, which multiplies in his hands effortlessly and endlessly by way of accrued interest. So the Jew's not actually working. He's just making money off of money. He's not doing anything to make money. He's stealing. That's the idea. That's wrong. The money he lent is his capital that has value that he could put into employment for himself, but he's letting you do it rather than himself because he either can't or won't or whatever. And he's giving you the opportunity to go out there and beat the odds and build a better life. And in exchange, you pay him back the money he loaned you, plus the expected amount he could have made as a baseline for having, if he would have had the money in his hands, putting it to use himself. That's what interest is about. So this is like a complete lie, but when people are economically struggling, as was happening at the time in Germany, it feels like, oh, the Jews aren't even working. They just loan money. And that money is your opportunity. It's your ability to build yourself out of the problem that you're in, guys. And interest is the payment to have been allowed to have access to that money and control over that money in the meantime, during which point the actual owner of the money is not able to make money off of his money. But anyway, no. His power is the power of money, which multiplies in his hands effortlessly and endlessly by way of accrued interest, and which forces the folk under the most dangerous of yokes, whose ultimately tragic consequences are concealed by the initial attraction of gold and glitter. Nobody borrows money to have gold and glitter. They borrow money to do something with it. If they're caught under the most dangerous of yokes, that they can't afford the life that they're living, and they get in the debt trap, that's the problem. But the whole point is that you're supposed to borrow the money if you can or when you can, and if you have smart lending, especially with smart lending policy, you don't get people caught in these debt cycles as much. That's the usury thing. And what you do instead is you give them the opportunity to go do something with money that's not theirs to build themselves. Now, here's the problem. Like, student loans are part of this story right now. The student loan lenders have lent people money to go to college, but college is a scam. You are buying something for far more money than it's worth, and that you're not probably going to be able to make it back. And then there's interest compounding on top of it. And so it's easy to hear this kind of rhetoric. Oh, that's one of the most dangerous of yokes. And who did it? The Jews. And we're actually hearing this today. This is what Hitler was saying in 1919, 20 years before he's given the Reichstag speech. Everything men strive after as a higher goal, Hitler says, be it religion, socialism, or democracy, is to the Jew but a means to an end, a way for him to satisfy his lust for money and domination. Imagine working your whole life in banking, trying to get people capital and let them build their lives better, and that's secretly a lust for money and domination. That's how you see it. Why? Because capitalism or free enterprise allows people to solve problems of people they're not related to and don't have particular concern for in self-interest. So self-interest becomes the magic sauce, the oil that makes the engine of the economy work. And then they get blamed for it, because when things aren't going well, it's easy to blame a scapegoat, and here's the ready scapegoat. And again, this is the same thing Karl Marx said, and this is the same thing our woke on the left and right today, but especially on the right, are saying. Everything men strive after as a higher goal, be it religion, socialism, or democracy, is to the Jew but a means to an end, a way for him to get richer and to gain dominance. This is the kind of propaganda Hitler was trafficking in 1919. In Mein Kampf, he's telling this story in retrospect, and so he must have had his secret anti-Semitic awakening before this. He goes on, in his effects and consequences, he, meaning the Jew, this is 1919, not 1939, not 1941 when they're gassing Jews. In his effects and consequences, he, meaning the Jew, is like a racial tuberculosis of nations and people. Why? Because he runs banks that allow people to borrow money to try to get out of debt and build something productive. Amazing. And this leads to the following conclusions. An anti-Semitism grounded solely on emotion will find its ultimate expression in the form of pogroms. An anti-Semitism grounded in reason, however, must lead to a systematic legal eradication and elimination of those privileges that distinguish the Jew from the other aliens who live among us through legislation concerning national aliens. The ultimate objective of such legislation must, however, be the irrevocable removal of the Jews in general. So don't let these woke right propagandists lie to you. Before the Nazi Party existed, when it was merely the German Workers' Party, the DAP, in 1919, Hitler explains you have two kinds of anti-Semitism, emotional and rational. The emotional kind is based off of hating Jews because you've run into them one-on-one. And that ends in pogroms. And that's, in his opinion, you can kind of infer low-level stuff. There's a rational reason, which is usury and interest and control of the media and finance and all of these different things, internationalism and international Jewry, as he goes on to call it, and eventually the link to Bolshevism. There are rational reasons to be anti-Semitic, and he distinguishes, and he says the emotional kind will find its ultimate expression in the form of pogroms. And anti-Semitism, just to read this part again slowly and clearly, Hitler 1919, before the Nazi Party existed, way before 14 years before he takes power, 20 years before the Holocaust begins. Anti-Semitism grounded in reason, however, must lead to systematic legal eradication and elimination of those privileges that distinguish the Jew from the other aliens who live among us through legislation concerning national aliens. The ultimate objective of such legislation must, however, be the irrevocable removal of the Jews in general. Only a government, he says, of national strength, never one of national impotence, is capable of achieving both these ends. The Republican Germany owes its birth not to the uniform national will of our folk, but the clever exploitation of a series of circumstances which found general expression in a deep, widespread sense of dissatisfaction. Again, parallels to today. The circumstances, however, were made independent of the form of the state structure and are still operative today, indeed now more than before. I'm butchered this. Let me do this whole paragraph again. The Republican Germany owes its birth, so that's the Weimar Republic, by the way, owes its birth not to the uniform national will of our folk, so the folk didn't really want it, but to the clever exploitation of a series of circumstances which found general expression in a deep, widespread sense of dissatisfaction. Okay, so in 1918, the Weimar Republic is established. It throws out the Kaiser, it throws out the old order, and he says this wasn't what the people wanted. It was an exploitation. It was a Jewish plot to take advantage of the sense of dissatisfaction. Now listen to the rhetoric that we deal with today. What do they say? We live in the post-World War II consensus. It wasn't the rational consensus or uniform national will of the folk, the heritage Americans, the real true conservatives that got sidelined by awful William Buckley. No, it wasn't that. That's not what it was. We instituted the post-World War II liberal consensus to believe that Hitler is the new Satan and so that the Jews will be protected, which found expression in a deep, widespread sense of dissatisfaction with fascists in World War II. So that's the message today. Hitler's playing the same message. The Weimar Republic was an exploitation, just like the post-war liberal consensus was an exploitation based on a sense of dissatisfaction. These circumstances, he says, however, were independent of the form of the state structure and are still operative today. Indeed, now more than before, meaning that sense of dissatisfaction is now greater. The post-World War II liberal consensus, just like the Weimar Republic, did not solve the problem because it didn't address what the folk or the heritage American or the true right wing really wanted. Thus, Hitler explains, a great portion of our folk recognizes that altering the form of the state cannot in and of itself alter and improve our situation. This rather will require a rebirth of the nation's moral and spiritual powers. This is exactly the same rhetoric as the woke right. It's not just taking power, we need to have a national rebirth. And Hitler says, and this rebirth cannot be initiated by a state leadership of irresponsible majorities influenced by certain party dogmas, an irresponsible press, or platitudes and slogans generated by the international community. It requires instead the relentless installation of a nationally minded leadership personality, Führer Persönlichkeiten or something, possessed, I didn't do that right at all, Führer Persönlichkeiten, I don't know. Fuck German. It requires instead the relentless installation of a nationally minded leadership personalities possessed of an inner sense of responsibility. This is where you hear the woke right guys talk about leadership invested with prudence and virtue. This fact, he says, that was a good pop of my mouth. This fact, though, robs the Republic of the essential inner support of the nation's spiritual forces, and thus today's state leaders are compelled to seek support among those who have used and continue to use the new reconstruction of Germany exclusively to their own advantage, and who, for this reason, were ultimately the driving force behind the revolution, the Jews. So again, they do blame the post-war liberal consensus on, we got to protect the poor Jews because the Holocaust, which they don't even think was real, even though you have Hitler saying this. Okay, so the lies that we're getting fed are unbelievable, but the repetition of the same structures is why I'm doing a podcast series on the Nazi experiment. We are being tempted to run this same experiment in America, I think mostly so that Republicans will lose all of our elections for a long time and the Democrats will usher in communism. But on its face, this movement is reproducing in young conservative men the exact same circumstances that led to the establishment not just of the Nazi movement, but of the Hitler Jugend, the Hitler Youth, that basically was the primary energy generator for the Nazi movement until it finally took power in the early 30s. Even though today's leaders, Hitler said, fully realize the danger of Jewry, as various statements from leading personalities attest, they are forced in their own self-interest to accept the readily proffered support of the Jews and to return the favor. This is where the Jews talk about the conception. And this payoff consists not only in favoring the Jews in every possible way, but above all in hindering the struggle of a deceived folk against its deceivers, that is, in repressing the anti-Semitic movement. Respectfully, Adolf Hitler. There's your everybody calls us anti-Semitic because they want to control us, IPAC buys congressmen, blah, 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 narratives of today. So we can read Hitler in 1939 and hear that he wants to destroy all the Jews. We can read Hitler in 1919 and hear that he wants to destroy the Jews and cause a complete rebirth of the nation. 20 years earlier, way before the war, way before the Holocaust, he was very clear the ultimate objective of such legislation must, however, be the irrevocable removal of the Jews in general. We already know that the Jews don't have a homeland, so where are they going? Well, maybe America will take them, maybe somewhere will take them, but he has other designs in mind in the end. The so-called final solution is going to be to get rid of them one way or another, and when he finally gets to World War II, he says outright that it'll cost their destruction if anybody tries to stop him in his wars of conquest. So don't let these propagandists lie to you anymore. Don't let them repeat the Nazi experiment with our children in an unchallenged way. They are lying, they are deceiving, and they are repeating the exact same propaganda structures as Hitler. And how can we know that? By reading Hitler. In his own words, across time. Letter in 1919, speech in 1939, and then Mein Kampf chapter after chapter after chapter written in the mid-1920s. We can turn to Carl Schmitt during his Nazi years, 1933 through 1936 in particular, writing the same exact stuff. It was very clear, very consistent. It is the only thing that's not consistently clear is whether the wholesale murder of the Jews was intended from the very beginning, but the wholesale removal of the Jews by one means or another, which eventually left only one means, was definitely on the table. And Hitler tried to use it as a literal hostage chip to prevent the war from arising as he decided to conquer Europe, including when he got into the war, he made an alliance with the Soviet Union and then betrayed them. There tons of reasons to believe that Hitler wasn't going to maintain peace with Britain, that he wouldn't have left the rest of the world unmolested eventually or not for long after he betrayed the Soviet Union that he had made an agreement with. So let's just be very realistic about what we're looking at. The Nazi experiment contained the idea that the only way for the German people to make itself great again and healthy again was literally to exterminate the Jews. And this is unambiguous in Hitler's own words. So we must stop letting these people lie, and we must stop letting this propaganda go unchallenged, reaching our young people. If you are a young person listening to this, you need to understand that your influencers are lying to you, that are feeding you this crap, that are telling you these things. They are lying to you, and they're repeating the exact same forms of propaganda and manipulation that led the Nazis to come into being in the first place. So if you grew up wondering how in the world the Nazis could have happened, it's by manipulating people like you through exactly the kind of propaganda that's being fed to you on social media every day. So this is an emergency. This is actually happening. To what end? The best case scenario is the destruction of the Republican Party and the reemergence and resurgence of the communist Democrats. Worst case scenario is to finish solving the Jewish question, which is why in every one of these podcasts I end the same way. We are at the moment. This is the time. Never again means never again, and never again is now.